Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSite Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in Geography we will be talking about climate change and sustainable development. To discuss this topic we have with us our sub-expert Dr. Asmita Bakshi. Dr. Bakshi's area of expertise lies in environmental studies and climate change negotiations. Without further ado, I would like to welcome ma'am to our studios and request her to start the lecture. Welcome ma'am.
Thank you, Amrit. Dear students, as you know, this lecture on climate change and sustainable development is a part of ongoing lecture series on sustainable development. This is also a second and last part of the topic climate change as a sustainable development goals. So before I start this lecture, I would like to brief you what we had discussed in earlier lecture. In that lecture, we have discussed the concept of climate and climate change, various mechanisms involved including natural and human factors which are responsible for climate change. We have also assessed the various impact of climate change throughout the world as well as in India. And we have also looked into the various indicators and observations which are produced by IPCC and UNFCCC in terms of climate change and its impacts. So in this session, we will be talking about briefly on sustainable development, relationship between sustainable development and climate change, what are their relationship and interlinkages, what are the challenges that climate change presents for sustainable development, and what are the techniques and mechanisms that can be used to overcome these challenges to attain sustainable development. So, let's start today's session with the concept of sustainable development. I am very much sure that you all must be heard about the term sustainable development as it is very popular nowadays. At the first place, the term sustainable development was introduced by the World Commission on Environment and Development, that is also popularly known as the Brundtland Commission. As the definition given by the Brundtland Commission, sustainable development means the development that meets the need of present generation without compromising the ability of future generation to meet their own needs. If we look into the definition or analyze the definition, then we may be able to understand that sustainable development is a pattern of equitable resource use that aim to meet the human needs while preserving the environment so that these needs can be fulfilled not only in the present but in the future also. So, there are major three domain areas of sustainable development to be focused on while pursuing for sustainable development, and that are environmental sector, social sector and economic sector. So now let's understand how and why these sectors are so much important for sustainable development. As per economic sector is concerned, we all know that the present globalized world economy is interlinked and interdependent, and these interdependent economic system demands an integrated approach to foster responsible long-term growth while ensuring that no nation and community is left behind. Another important domain is social development. If we concentrate on social development, then we may find that there are a large number of population throughout the world that require job, food, education, energy, healthcare, water and proper sanitation. And in terms of sustainable development, it need to be keep in mind that while addressing these issues, the world community must ensure that the rich fabric of social and cultural diversity and the right of workers are respected, and that all members of society are empowered to play a determining role in their future. So, the next and last domain of the sustainable development is environmental domain. environmental domain, we all know that very significant and important sector for sustainable development, because ignoring environment for any kind of development will destroy socio-economic development in the long run. So it is very important to conserve our natural heritage, natural resources for future generation. Economically viable solution must be developed to reduce resource consumption, stop pollution, and to conserve natural habitat. So, in this way, we have studied three major domains of sustainable development, that is economic, social, and environmental. And here I would like to tell you that all the domains of sustainable development are interlinked or interdependent. We cannot overlook any one of the domain for the sake of development in other domain. All three domains are affected by each other and influence each other in many ways. So it can be said that sustainable development is a multidimensional way of thinking about the interdependencies among natural, social, and economic system in our world. It represents a process in which economic, finance, trade, agriculture, and other industrial policies are implemented in a way to bring about development that is economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable. So, after this, we have understood the concept of sustainable development, its major domain and principle. So now, based upon this, we can draw some concluding facts about sustainable development. So let's have a look on that. Sustainable development includes social development, economic opportunity on the one hand, and the requirement of environment on the other. It looks at the equity between countries and continent, races and classes, gender and ages. It is based on improving the quality of life for all, especially the poor and deprived, within the carrying capacity of the supporting ecosystem. Therefore, sustainable development is a process which leads to a better quality of life while reducing the impact on environment. So, these are some factual information about sustainable development, and here I would like to tell you that there are many challenges the world faces today in terms of sustainable development, such as poverty, hunger, malnutrition, environmental degradation. All these issues are there to deal with in order to attain sustainable development. There are few observations of United Nations and other international organizations which I would like to put before you for your better understanding. So let's have a look on that. In terms of poverty, 1.3 billion people live on less than $1 per day, and 3 billion people on less than $2 per day. It is important to note here that top 20% of income group uses 86% of resources, while bottom 20% of income group uses less than 1.3% of resources. As shelter is concerned, many population are living in areas that are susceptible to civil strife, environmental degradation, and natural disasters. Food security is another major concern for sustainable development, as a large number of population are living without access proper nutrition. As it is noted that 800 million people are malnourished today, and with this situation the food production needs to be double in the next 35 years. Water security and energy security are another major concern for sustainable development, as 1.3 billion people are living without access to clean water and 2 billion people are living without proper sanitation and proper electricity. All these concerns are very important because these fulfill the primary need for human survival. And Environmental degradation is another major concern for sustainable development the world faces today, as 1.4 billion people are exposed to dangerous level of outdoor pollution and even larger number exposed to dangerous level of indoor air pollution and vector-borne diseases. So these are the traditional challenges are present in terms of sustainable development, and here climate change adds to these traditional challenges for sustainable development by affecting significantly social development and economic growth by reducing the quality of favorable environment. So let's have a look how and why climate change is affecting efforts for sustainable development. I have already mentioned in my earlier lecture the mechanisms and impacts of climate change for socio-economic development and other sectors for sustainable development. So let's understand this in brief here also. Here you can see that climate system is very sensitive to a slight change in average statistics of climatic pattern. That is, with slight change in climatic pattern, climate system like temperature may increase, variation in precipitation, increase intensity and frequency of extreme weather events, and ice cover may change, sea level rise. All of these are a result of slight change in climatic conditions, and all these variation in climate system affects the natural resources in adverse manner. For example, water scarcity, land degradation, ecosystem degradation, biodiversity loss, an adverse impact on marine resources and any other resources. All these negatively affected resources affect human security in terms of food, water, energy, health, income and livelihood. These insecurity results in social and political instability, and these factors altogether cause a major concern for sustainable development. So here I would like to tell you it is not only climate change that affect the efforts for sustainable development, but many activities that are being taken up for sustainable development also contribute to climate change. So here you can see that climate change influences natural and human living conditions and thus social and economic development on the one hand, and on the other side society's priority on sustainable development influences greenhouse gas emissions, causing climate change and vulnerability. So it can be said that it is not only climate change that affects sustainable development efforts, but sustainable development priorities also cause climate change in many ways. So it establishes the two-way relationship between climate change and sustainable development. Climate change will have an impact on prospects for sustainable development, and in turn alternative development paths will certainly affect future climate change. There are some observations which I would like to put before you will help you to understand the multiple linkages between climate change and sustainable development. For example, economic development affects ecosystem balance and in turn is affected by the state of ecosystem. Similarly, extreme socio-economic inequalities within communities and between nations may undermine the social cohesion and would promote sustainability and make policy responses more effective. Another example is poverty can be a cause and a result of environmental degradation. At the same time, socio-economic and technology policy decisions made for non-climate related regions have significant implications for climate policy and climate change impacts, as well as for the other environmental issues. In addition, critical impact threshold and vulnerability to climate change impacts are directly connected to environmental, social and economic conditions and institutional capacities. So these are few examples which will help you to understand the multiple linkages between climate change and sustainable development. So here the question arises, the main challenge is how to balance between economic growth and environmental integrity, the main challenge of these two-way relationship. So the main question here is how to make balance between these two phenomena like economic growth and environmental integrity. So it can be done through integrated climate change and sustainable development strategy. So here you can see that earlier viewpoint where climate change and sustainable development were both separate issues to deal with, where climate change was related to the problem of natural sciences only to be dealt at the level of the world, and whereas sustainable development was related to the problem driven social sciences, addressing the socio-economic and environmental problem at the local level. But later on, many studies done by IPCC and various other scholars established that both of the issues are not separate issues, and we deal with both of the issue. We need an integrated climate change and sustainable development strategy. So after all these, it is established that sustainable development will be achieved through implementing integrated governance system that promote economic growth in a manner that contributes to greater social equity and maintains the ongoing capacity to the natural environment to provide ecological services upon which socio-economic development depends. So now the question is how this can be integrated, how the strategy can be integrated. So there are two terms for this. One is mitigation at the first stage, and for the later stages there is a adaptation. So let's understand what both of the term mitigation and adaptation means. Mitigation means, as the definition given by Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, mitigation refers to any technological change and substitution that reduce resource input and emission per unit of output, although several social, economic and technological policies would produce an emission reduction with respect to climate change. Mitigations means and implementing policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and enhance their sinks. So in this way, it is understood that any anthropogenic intervention that can either reduce the sources of greenhouse gases emission or enhance their sink is called mitigation actions. Thus, after looking at the definition, we are able to understand that mitigation is related to reducing the causes of climate change. And let's understand what the adaptation means. Adaptation, as per definition given by IPCC, adaptation refers to changes in practice, process or structure to take changing climate conditions into account, to moderate potential damages and to benefit from opportunities that arise from climate change. Therefore, adaptation is an adjustment in natural or human systems to a new or changing environment that exploits beneficial opportunities or moderates negative effects. This, after understanding the mitigation and adaptation, we are able to know that mitigation is related to the reducing the cause of climate change at the first level by reducing the potential of greenhouse gas emissions, and adaptation is related to the reducing the negative impact of climate change for human and natural system. So now let's understand how these two actions, that is mitigation and adaptation, can be integrated into the circular interaction of climate domain and sustainable development domain. Here you can see the circular interaction between climate domain and sustainable development domain, and it is clearly visible here that socio-economic development paths like economic growth, technology, population and governance contribute to some extent to the greenhouse gas emissions and concentration into the atmosphere, and with integration of mitigation actions, which I would be talking in the further slides, with integration of mitigation actions, these concentration and emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere can be reduced, and it will automatically reduce the negative impact of greenhouse gas emission on the natural system. And on the second or later stages, the negative impact of climate system to natural and human system will be reduced further with integration of adaptation techniques or with the changing of behavior. And also natural and human system, further we can reduce the impact on social and development path by incorporating various adaptation techniques in our activities for development. So these with the integration of mitigation and adaptation into our activities and actions, we can minimize the impact, we can minimize the emission of greenhouse gases as well as the negative impact of climate change to our natural and human system as well as the socio-economic development paths. So now let's understand what are the mitigation and adaptation activities that can be integrated in our daily life so that we can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions as well as negative impact of climate change. As I have already mentioned that mitigation actions are related to reducing the greenhouse gas emissions at the first level. So these actions include sustainable transport, energy conservation, building code changes to improve efficiency, renewable energy, expand deep lake water cooling, improve vehicle fuel efficiency, capture and use landfill and digester gas. In waste management, reduce, reuse and recycle principle can be used for mitigation or to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. As per adaptation is concerned, as I have already mentioned that adaptation means to reduce the negative impact of climate change to natural and human societies. It includes city heat response plan, ozone response activities, making alternative school schedules, temperature trigger studies, indoor water quality evaluation, water quality testing, power vulnerability study, power pricing study, urban wetland management plan, ecosystem diversity index, emergency response planning and coordination, and food supply research. These mitigation and adaptation strategy, there are some other strategy that can be used, for example like use of geothermal, solar thermal energy, making district heating, building code for natural ventilation, tree planting and care, local food production, water conservation, making green roofs and climate sensitive procurement, increasing public education regarding climate change and sustainable development. So these are the major activities in terms of mitigation and adaptation that can be used for mitigation and adaptation of climate change. Here I would like to tell you it is not only at the climate change and sustainable development mechanism level, but some linkages also there at the policy level. So here you can see as some sustainable development policy can contribute to climate change mitigations, and some climate change policy can contribute as a sustainable development efforts. Here you can see that alternative development pathways we can adopt for sustainable development can contribute ultimately to climate change mitigation also. Some environmental and economic policy also contribute to climate change mitigations indirectly. As I would like to tell you that biofuel policy in Brazil did not have any objective to contribute climate change, but it did contribute to climate change mitigation. There are many more policies and initiatives like that for sustainable development can contribute to climate change mitigation also. Another thing is institutional and infrastructural change for sustainable development, and innovation and technology also can contribute to climate change mitigation. And if we see from the climate change policy perspective that we can avoid the climate change impact not only from greenhouse gas emission reduction but also from capacity building that can contribute to sustainable development also. Climate change policy also has ancillary benefits, spillover and trade effects that is also contribute to sustainable development level also. So these can be done with this observation also. You can understand better the policy linkages between climate change and sustainable development, like mitigation options that improve productivity of resource use generally yield sustainable development benefits. Climate related policies, for example, energy efficiency are often economically beneficial, improve energy security, reduce local and pollution, and create jobs. So there are many more examples for this that can make you understand the multiple linkages between climate change and sustainable development. So here I would like to conclude this session by saying climate change is widely considered to be one of the greatest challenges to modern human civilization that has profound socio-economic environmental impacts. It is essential to develop a portfolio of strategies that include adaptation, mitigation, technological development and research. It is imperative for countries to take a proactive role in planning national and regional programs in adaptation to climate variability and climate change. And it is very important to integrate mitigation and adaptation techniques into sustainable development framework and planning for sustainable development and to mitigate climate change. And it is very urgent need, especially and in developing countries. And with this, I would like to end this session. Thank you so much. Welcome students. In this session, we will be talking about international initiatives that have been taken so far to mitigate and adaptation of climate change. So, before I start this session, I would like to brief you with the Sustainable Development Goals for mitigation and adaptation of climate change. This will help you to understand the efficacy of the ongoing programs and initiatives to attain sustainable development by the end of 2030. So, let's have a look on the Sustainable Development Goals before starting this session. The first goal says to strengthen resilience and adaptive capacity to climate-related hazards and natural disasters in all countries, to integrate climate change measures into national policies, strategies and planning, to improve education, awareness raising and human and institutional capacity on climate change mitigation, adaptation, impact reduction and early warning system. Another goal is to implement the commitment undertaken by developed country parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to a goal of mobilizing jointly $100 billion annually by 2020 from all sources to address the need of developing countries in the context of meaningful mitigation actions and transparency on implementation and fully operationalize Green Climate Fund through its capitalization as soon as possible. And the last goal says to promote mechanism for raising capacity for effective climate change related planning and management in least developed countries and small island developing states, including focusing on women, youth, local and marginalized communities. So, these are the targets in terms of climate change that are set to be accomplished by 2030. So, now let us start today's session with the history of climate change study. Climate change study was started as early as in 1896 with Arrhenius hypothesis. Arrhenius was a Swedish physicist, was popularly known as chemist also. He proposed in his hypothesis that the industrial age carbon dioxide emission can enhance greenhouse gas effect and then can cause an increase in Earth's temperature. After that, during the 1960s, extensive use of quantitative techniques and mathematical model gave impetus to this scientific assessment and study of climate change. And the world community realized that climate is changing with a high rate and it may have some negative effects on socio-economic development. This concept and various scientific studies done in terms of climate change give an background for environmentalism. The concept of environmentalism came in 1970s and it believes that nature and environment determines human behavior, whether it is social, economic or cultural. And people realize that if we ignore environment for any kind of development, that it may have devastating consequences for socio-economic development in long run. So, in order to address various issues of climate change, the first World Climate Conference was organized in 1979, where the conference identified that climate change is an urgent global problem and it should be addressed at the earliest possible. After that, in 1988, Toronto Climate Conference recommended to develop a comprehensive global framework convention for climate change protection, and at the same year Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was established by United Nations General Assembly. All these activities framed a climate change regime, and since the formation of climate change regime there are many activities that have been done so far and something are being done at current level. So there are major and some important activities that can be regarded as a milestone in climate change regime. So let's have a look on that. In 1990, after the establishment of IPCC, IPCC came up with its first assessment report having some various concern for socio-economic development of the negative impacts of climate change. So following this report, the world community in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit adopted Agenda 21 for Sustainable Development and adopted United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to combat climate change in order to attain sustainable development. So after that execution of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and adoption of Kyoto Protocol, that is a single legally binding agreement in the climate change regime to stabilize or to minimize the greenhouse gas emissions. After that, in 2007, IPCC came up with its fourth assessment report having some serious observations. The report says that with the current rate of greenhouse gas emissions, the temperature may increase by 3.5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century, and proposed that if the world community will not stabilize or reduce the greenhouse gas emission, then there would be some serious consequences for low-lying coastal countries and island nations. To some more extreme cases, the low-lying coastal countries may lose their 60% of coastal land areas, and into some more extreme cases, some island states like Maldives, Kiribati, Fiji, etc. may lose their entire land mass due to the sea level rise. And the report also proposed that temperature should not rise beyond 2 degrees Celsius. After recognizing the seriousness of this fourth assessment report by IPCC, the world community started more serious actions to combat climate change or to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. So in that process, there are some milestones like Cancun Agreement, Durban Climate Conference, Doha Climate Conference, Warsaw Climate Conference, and the most important Paris Agreement. So I will be talking about all these in detail further in this session. And here I would like to start with Agenda 21. Agenda 21 is a set of non-binding action sets that is to be implemented by United Nations and other multilateral organizations, regional and national governments. It is a non-binding set of actions for 21st century, and it was adopted in 1992 with the objective to provide substantial assistance for developing countries in their sustainable development. Sustainable development goal for Agenda 21 has 4 parts. The first part deals with socio-economic dimension that includes combating poverty, especially in developing and poor countries, changing consumption patterns, promoting healthcare services, achieving more sustainable population and sustainable settlements in decision-making processes. The second part of Agenda 21 consists of conservation and management of resource development for development. It includes environmental protection, combating deforestation, protecting fragile ecosystem, conservation of biodiversity, pollution control, and waste management, including biotechnical, biochemical, and radiative waste. The third section of Agenda 21 is about strengthening the role of major groups. That includes role of children, women, youth, NGOs, local authorities, business, industries, workers, and the more importantly, role of indigenous people, communities, and farmers. So, the fourth and last section of Agenda 21 deals with means of implementation that include science, technological transfer, education, institutional infrastructure and financial mechanism for smoothly running the ongoing programs and initiatives for sustainable development. So, the Agenda 21 is all about sustainable development. So, let's come to the climate change program and initiatives. That is United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I would like to tell you that UNFCCC is the apex body for climate change in the climate change regime, under which all the decisions and negotiations are being taken up. It is an international environment treaty that is adopted in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit. It has the basic objective to stabilize greenhouse gas concentration into the atmosphere at the level that would interfere with the climatic system. So, the UNFCCC works with the basic principle of common but differentiated responsibility. The common but differentiated responsibility means the problem of climate change is common for all countries, but responsibility may vary depending upon their contribution to the problem and their ability to cope with the problem. It means that developed countries are historically more responsible for the problem of climate change, thus they should take the lead to address the problem and they should take the lead and assist developing and poor countries to deal with the climate change. So, the UNFCCC works through Conference of Parties, that is COP, and that take place every year to make decisions and negotiations on various issues related to the climate change. Parties to the conference refers to the signatories countries of UNFCCC, and under UNFCCC parties are categorized into three major categories, that is Annex 1 countries that include member of Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development and countries with economy in transition. Annex 2 countries involves all Annex 1 countries and countries without economy in transition. This means Annex 2 category consists of all the developed countries, and these countries are required to provide some technical and financial assistance to all the developing country to make them able to deal with climate change in terms of mitigation and adaptation. So, the third category is non-Annex 1 country, generally consist of developing and vulnerable country. The last category also consists of the most vulnerable group of countries, that is small island developing states, which are vulnerable because of their some certain geographic characteristics, and the least developed countries which are economically backward and they do not have such resources to deal with climate change. So, all these are the structure and working of UNFCCC, under which all the decisions, all the plans are being made and implemented to combat climate change. So, another major important initiative in terms of climate change, that is Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto Protocol is a single legally binding agreement to reduce the global greenhouse gas emissions. It was adopted in the third conference of parties in 1997. Kyoto Protocol legally binds developed countries to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by at least 5% below 1990 levels, and these targets may vary by country to country. it has two commitment periods. The first commitment period was from 2008 to 2012 and the second commitment period is 2013 to 2020. And it is very important to note here that the second commitment period was signed by EU, that is European Union, and few other developing countries that altogether are responsible for only 15% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. And with notable exclusion of EU, US, Japan, Canada, Russia, means that beyond 2020 the cost of emission cut can be 4 times higher and a rise in global temperature can be expected to 3.5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. So the second commitment period has very limited scope in combating climate change. So now the Kyoto Protocol has some flexible mechanisms also that can contribute in meeting reduction targets for countries, and that is emission trading, joint implementation and clean development mechanisms. Here you can see all three mechanisms that consider greenhouse gas emission as a commodity that can be traded between countries. Joint implementation is a project-based mechanism which assists countries to implement their projects jointly, and where developed country parties assist other developed country party or developing country with technology and finance, and in turn they purchase their reduction unit to meet their own reduction targets. Similarly, clean development mechanism is also a project based mechanism in which developed country parties assist developing country to run their mitigation and adaptation projects in their country, and in return they purchase their certified emission reductions unit so that developed country can make their reduction targets. And the other mechanism is emission trading. It is a system to sell and purchase assigned amount of unit, that is carbon emission or greenhouse gas emissions. In this also, developed country assist developing country with financial resources to make them able to run their own programs and initiatives by purchasing their reduction unit in return. So these are the mechanisms under Kyoto Protocol that are being used by the countries to making their reduction targets accomplished. So after all these, there are many more initiatives that have been taken up under the UNFCCC and through its various scopes. So let's have a look on some of the major decisions taken under various scopes. In 2010 at Cancun Climate Conference, the Cancun Agreement was adopted, and for the first time developing countries took participation in emission reduction despite the fact of common but differentiated responsibility. The Cancun Agreement include voluntary pledges made by 76 countries and developing countries to control their emission of greenhouse gases. And it is important to note here that all these 76 countries were collectively responsible for 85% of annual global emissions. After Cancun, in 2011, Durban Climate Conference was held, and here the conference parties proposed 8-year extension of Kyoto Protocol with existing mechanism and provisions from 2013 to 2020. Additionally, parties agreed to develop another legally binding provision for all parties including developed and developing, which was scheduled to be adopted in Conference of Parties 21 in 2015, and it is to be implemented by 2020 and replace Kyoto Protocol's second commitment period. That is also a major breakthrough in climate change regime. In 2012, at Doha Climate Conference, Doha Climate Gateway was adopted, which has the certain provisions to combat climate change where an 8-year extension to Kyoto Protocol was granted until 2020. But as I have already mentioned, that due to the lack of participation of Canada, Japan, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, New Zealand and the United Nations, it has limited scope to only 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions and carbon dioxide emissions. Also, due to the fact that developing countries like China, which is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, and India and Brazil are not subject to any emission reduction under the Kyoto Protocol. The Doha Climate Gateway also made a little progress towards the funding under Green Climate Fund. After that, at Warsaw Climate Conference, Warsaw Climate Conference, a mechanism for loss and damage was adopted for the first time. That means developed countries should provide financial assistance to developing country for their loss and damage due to the negative impact of climate change that could not be avoided with strong mitigation and adaptation activities. So, this was a success for developing countries that they will get paid for their loss and damage due to the negative impact of climate change. Additionally, Warsaw Climate Conference proposed $100 billion fund transfer from developed country to developing country annually from 2020 and $10 billion annually between 2010 and 2012. So, these are the major decisions that have been taken, and the most important decision is Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement is said to be a comprehensive agreement that will help to attain sustainable development goal by the 2030. It has a lot of provision, so let's have a look on that. In terms of temperature, Paris Agreement says to keep temperature well below 2 degrees Celsius and to continue all efforts to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. In terms of finance, rich countries must provide $100 billion from 2020 as a floor and this amount to be updated by 2025. In terms of differentiation, developed countries must take lead and developing countries are also encouraged to enhance their efforts to move over for emission cuts. In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, Paris Agreement says that emissions should peak as soon as possible or before 2020, and from 2015 a rapid reduction in greenhouse gas emissions to achieve climate neutrality. For burden sharing, the Paris Agreement says developed countries must provide financial resources to help developing countries, and other countries are also invited to provide voluntary support for developing countries. Paris Agreement has also review mechanisms, and it is scheduled to review the agreement at every 5 years, and each review will inform countries in updating and enhancing their pledges. Vulnerable countries also want the recognition in the need of preventing, minimizing and addressing losses suffered due to climate change. So, these are the provisions and agreements that have been adopted under the umbrella of UNFCCC. And there are few other mechanisms and financial mechanisms that are present for assistance or for sustainable development to developing countries. As I have already mentioned, emission trading, clean development mechanisms, joint implementation, and there is another mechanism, that is technological mechanism, that aims to promote technology development and support technology transfer that enables climate change mitigation and adaptation in developing countries. Another major mechanism is reduced emission from deforestation and degradation that targets developing countries and aims to promote emission reduction in forestry sector by addressing deforestation and supporting sustainable forestry management. As I have already mentioned, that mechanism for loss and damage associated with the climate change, it was established in COP19 in Warsaw. This mechanism aims to promote integrated approach to address loss and damage resulting from climate change impacts in developing countries. It aims to build knowledge on managing climate risk, strengthening cooperation among various stakeholders, and promoting and enhancing disaster risk management actions. As per the climate financial mechanisms are concerned, there are many mechanisms for this. First mechanism is Global Environment Facilities. It is an international partnership and serves as the financial mechanism for several environmental conventions including UNFCCC. Another funding mechanism is Least Developed Countries Fund. This was established to support implementation of National Adaptation Program of Action in least developed countries which are especially vulnerable to the climate change impacts. And there are many more financial mechanisms are there, like Special Climate Change Fund that focuses on financing long and short term adaptive activities in various sectors and promote technology transfer. Another major finance is Adaptation Fund that supports adaptation program and projects in developing countries and that are parties to Kyoto Protocol. The last funding mechanisms is Green Climate Fund, which is very important. I have already mentioned, was established at COP16 to serve an operating body of conventions financial mechanisms in long term. And I would like to conclude this session by figuring out different mechanisms and tools at different levels. So at the global level, there are two major mechanisms, that is UNFCCC and Kyoto Protocol. At the regional level, there are a lot of mechanisms like tradable quotas, joint implementation, clean development mechanism, harmonized emissions, carbon and energy taxes, quotas, international technologies, product standards, voluntary agreements, and direct international transfer of financial resources and technological resources. And at the national or country level, there are also some mechanisms are present like emission carbon or energy taxes, subsidies, deposit fund system, voluntary agreements, permit quotas, or that would be tradable or not tradable, and technology and performance standards, product bans, direct government spending including research and development investment. So these are different mechanisms and initiatives that are present at different level including global, regional and country level. This will help to combat climate change and to attain sustainable development goals by the 2030. So with this, I would like to end this session. Thank you for watching. Thank you so much.
On that note, I would like to thank ma'am for this very enriching discussion, and thank you dear friends for watching our show. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.